In 2103, good news began to spread across what remained of the eastern end of the former United States. Appalachia, a land thought lost to inhuman monsters, was becoming safe for habitation again. People looking for a better life in the relative ecological utopia flocked to the region. While many of these immigrants were newcomers to the territory, there were those for whom the trip was a homecoming. I'm the Resolute Cartographer, and this is the story of those returning wastelanders. This is the story of the Raiders of the Crater. The story of the Raiders of the Crater begins over 2 decades prior in the middle of the autumn of 2077. The slopes of the Pleasant Valley Ski Resort were open, and vacationers had rushed in. When the bombs came down on Saturday, October 23, 2077, those vacationers and the staff of the resort at which they stayed found themselves stranded. The harrowing nuclear winter of 2077 to 2078 reshaped these survivors into raiders. In the summer of 2078, their leadership was fractured, and one gang became 5. Though these 5 gangs would maintain friendly relations with each other, they went their separate ways, setting up their own outposts up and down the mountains that became known as the Savage Divide. While the largest gang, the Cutthroats, remained in Pleasant Valley, Margie McClintock led her followers, the second largest gang, north, and they set themselves up in the Sunnytop Ski Lanes Resort. While all 5 of the gangs survived on goods stolen from passing merchant caravans and raids on the settlements in the valleys around them, they had very different ideals on the proper way to extract what they needed. While the Cutthroats would simply murder their targets and take what they needed, Margie McClintock's people preferred armed robbery. They would take the loot they wanted and let the victims go if they cooperated. They named themselves the Diehards, hoping that the name itself would be enough to convince some of their victims to surrender what they carried. Unfortunately, in the post-apocalypse, keeping those goods was itself a life-or-death situation for many of those who carried them. Holdups often ended in gunfire and death. As time went on and the confrontations became more and more likely to end in violence, many of the diehards stopped doing holdups and went straight to killing. For their attempts at bloodless robbery, the diehards established a reputation of being the goody two-shoes gang amongst the raiders of the Savage Divide, and they were mocked for their name and their methods by the other gangs. They extended this reputation when they became the guardians of the Palace of the Winding Path. Once a retreat for those seeking serenity in the increasingly fractious world of the pre-war, the Palace of the Winding Path had continued to numb its guests to the outside world after the bombs came down. Providing the palace with protection wasn't a wholly philanthropic exercise for the diehards, as the palace produced a great volume of drugs from which they paid the diehards. But the work helped to cement a sort of outsider status for the diehards amongst their peers. Over the years, Margie McClintock kept the diehards at peace with the other gangs and generally out of trouble. Though they faced threats from survivor groups like the Brotherhood of Steel, the Free States, and the Responders, and monsters like the Super Mutants, nothing could have prepared them for the sudden emergence of the Scorch Beasts in the late spring of 2086. The first widespread news of these giant bats came from their destruction of the nearby town of Harper's Ferry. In this attack, it was discovered that the Scorch Beasts spread an illness to their victims known as the Scorched Plague. This illness converted new hosts into red-skinned, green crystal-embedded monsters known as the Scorched. The Scorched would turn on their former allies and become servants of the Scorch Beasts. Attacks by either the Beasts or the Scorched were incredibly dangerous, as they both spread the Scorched Plague. Over the next 10 years, the monsters that spread this illness and the illness itself tore the post-war society of Appalachia apart. By 2095, the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel was fighting for survival. The Free States were underground, and the Responders were fighting a losing battle against the Scorched in the Toxic Valley. In the mountains, the original 5 gangs of the Raiders of the Savage Divide had been whittled down to 2. Only the Diehards and the Cutthroats remained. When the residents of the Palace of the Winding Path disappeared without a trace, Margie McClintock lost the will she had to go on. She abandoned her followers and wandered over to the empty palace, where she overdosed on pills and booze. After a failed attempt to unite with the Cutthroats against the Scorched ended in combat between the groups, most of the diehards had had enough. A few weeks into Margie's absence, one of her lieutenants, Meg Groberg, took charge. There isn't much known of Meg Groberg in her time before the war. Even her presence within the diehards isn't much of a clue as to her location on the day of the bombs, as the raiders did recruit outsiders. What is known is that Meg's mother couldn't take life in the world after the bombs, and so she took the easy way out. When she joined the diehards, Meg abided by Margie's rules of engagement for a time, but dropped them when it became clear that holdups were generally far more dangerous than simply killing their targets. She grew more and more disillusioned with Margie's leadership, finally taking her disappearance as a sign that it was time to abandon ship. She gathered many of the diehards to her side, and together they fled Appalachia. By 2097, the surface of Appalachia was human-free. a status that it would maintain for the next 5 years. Over those years, what remained of the diehards wandered the wasteland, visiting DC, Maryland, and Pennsylvania at the very least, picking up new followers as they went. Things back in Appalachia began to change on October 23, 2102, or Reclamation Day as it came to be known. On that first Reclamation Day, the dwellers of Vault 76 burst forth from their subterranean home and set about making Appalachia habitable again. While sorting through the ruins of the world, the former dwellers of Vault 76 managed to finish a Scorched Plague inoculation that was being developed by the responders, and defeated the Queen of the Scorch Beasts, making Appalachia far safer for human habitation. By 2103, news of their success was spreading across the eastern end of the former United States, drawing interested parties of all stripes. This news also included rumors of a hoard of treasure hidden in a vault in the mountains. Fertile land and a mountain of loot were incentives that were hard to pass up. While many of those who soon arrived in Appalachia were newcomers, the former diehards were ready to come home after their years in exile. When Meg and her raiders arrived in Appalachia, they decided against returning to their old haunt of Sunnytop ski lanes. Why this isn't obvious, as both the resort and the location they chose were home to super mutants at the time the raiders returned. But if the reason was to get a fresh start or to claim an impressive site for their new home, they succeeded. In the weeks after the nuclear war had ended the world, the United States Space Agency Space Station Valiant 1 had come crashing down into the northern reaches of Appalachia, somehow remaining mostly intact despite the atmospheric re-entry and the impact with the Earth. The old space station was a point of interest to the survivors of the bombs. Though before the scorching, most had avoided the site because of how severely toxic the environment around it was, Meg and her raiders would turn it into their new home. When the raiders arrived, they made some extensive changes to the layout of the crashed space station. The main body of the space station was a large wheel with spoke-like tunnels connecting the outer ring to a hub module at the center. They excavated around the central hub module and broke it free from the ring by severing the tunnels that connected it to them. They then reoriented the hub so that it sat flat above the ground. The raiders called this module the Crater Core. The central room of the Crater Core would serve as Meg's throne room, complete with electric chair throne. The old tunnels off the throne room served as homes to several high-profile raiders. Rooms were excavated beneath the crater core, creating more space for additional raiders. Outside the crater core, other parts of the space station became home to various shops, housing, workshops, and a bar. While most of the crater raiders occupied crater itself, there were a few other outposts permanently occupied by the raiders of the crater. A ways to the west of crater, there lay another small chunk of Space Station Valiant. The Crater Raiders came to occupy this site, calling it Crater Watch Station. A generic cast of raiders used it to watch the western approach of their headquarters to the east. Other than that, there was also a Crater Raider outpost at the site of the old water recreation company known as Ohio River Adventure. Shortly after the crashed space station became Crater, 3 raiders known as Fishbones, Black Eye, and Gills were dispatched to open a Mirelurk meat and egg harvesting station. Along with bringing in food and trade goods, Fishbones thought this was potentially a means for Meg to get him out of the way as a rival for power. On the trip to establish the site, Gills was beaten so badly by an attacker that he couldn't walk anymore. In response to this, Fishbones hired the attacker as a new member of the team. Bruiser, as he was known, was once a vault dweller, and before that, seemingly a football player, although his memory seemed damaged enough that no one could be sure. Black Eye got her nickname from a misstep on the dock that led her to trip and land on her face. Before the war, she was a first-grade teacher, but she preferred life as a raider to dealing with a horde of kids. Along with the permanent outposts, the Crater Raiders also came to temporarily occupy sites as they scavenged for supplies to return to Crater. Though things were generally safer in Appalachia than they had been, the Scorched had not been fully vanquished, and the red-skinned monsters that the raiders had fled were causing problems on the borders of their territory. To counter this threat, Meg dispatched a party of fighters to battle a group of them to the south. Not long after this squad was sent out, a strange signal began to play over the radio, and Meg heard a voice she had thought she might never hear again. It was David Thorpe, the old boss of the Cutthroat Raiders, the murderer of hundreds of innocent civilians and settlers, calling Meg to meet him at the old Raider HQ, the top of the world. She didn't dare miss the meeting. What she found when she got there was another surprise, a former vault dweller of Vault 76. A few days before Meg would hear David Thorpe's message, the overseer of Vault 76 had called that vault dweller over the radio and summoned them to her new headquarters in Sutton. She explained that there were waves of newcomers arriving in Appalachia, and unlike her and the other 76ers, they weren't immune to the scorched plague. If they weren't careful, they would have another scorching situation on their hands. Therefore, the Overseer sent the Vault Dweller out to meet the newcomers and to get them to agree to an administration of the inoculation. As the people at Crater looked like raiders, the Overseer reluctantly suggested that the Vault Dweller first make contact with Rose. High above the Pleasant Valley Ski Resort at the top of the world resort, Rose, the robotic raider, served as the last vestige of the power that was the Cutthroat Raider Gang. Created by David Thorpe as a simulacrum of his girlfriend Rosalind Jeffries, Rose had weathered the scorching alone, watching the world fall apart around her. When the former dwellers of Vault 76 had been investigating the world left behind after the scorching, Rose had made a trade with them. She provided them with a bit of tech that they needed in return for having granted her access to broadcasting equipment. In the aftermath of this, she had begun to broadcast a widespread appeal to return to Appalachia. Because of her past cooperation and her status as the last friendly raider of the old school, she had invaluable information that she could share to help the Vault Dweller contact the new raiders at Crater. While the Overseer hadn't enjoyed her own interaction with Rose, she hoped that Rose might be willing to cooperate with the Vault Dwellers again. From her perch atop the top of the world, Rose had watched the newcomers arrive and recognized Meg from her days in the Diehards. Rose wasn't terribly impressed with Meg, given that she had abandoned Appalachia before the worst of the scorching, but she knew just how to help the Vault Dweller get Meg's attention and her appreciation. David Thorpe had been one of the most feared men in Appalachia before the scorching. Fortunately for all involved, David Thorpe had fallen, first to the Scorched Plague, then to the Vault Dweller, who had just the past year put the Scorched Raider boss down on Rose's behalf. While his absence was a welcome change for Appalachia, it did make recording his voice a challenge. Luckily, Rose had a solution to this problem. She had a database of recordings of her conversations with David Thorpe, from which she could create a recording of David calling Meg. Unfortunately, Thorpe had locked these recordings up due to their personal and potentially embarrassing nature. Therefore, Rose sent the Vault Dweller out to find the key to this data. A key that was stored on a holotape at the shrine that Thorpe had erected to honor Rosalind Jeffries after he had inadvertently and unknowingly killed her. Though the holotape with the key was broken, a piece of tech at a local intelligence base allowed the Vault Dweller to create a clean copy. Once accessed, Rose discovered that her database was missing a word that she needed to create a recording of Thorpe: negotiate. The Vault Dweller had to find another recording of the dead warlord. David Thorpe's old pre-war stomping grounds, Arctos Pharma, served as the perfect search location. In the time before he became the raider boss of the Savage Divide, he was a corporate raider working at a pharmaceutical company. The Vault Dweller found the perfect tape, and Rose constructed a brand new threatening summons. With a quick trip to a nearby broadcast tower, David Thorpe's message was broadcasting across the region, calling Meg to the mezzanine of the top of the world. The Vault Dweller returned to the top of the world and prepared the mezzanine for Meg's arrival, clearing it of a residue of the Scorched. As if on cue, as the last Scorched fell, Meg arrived with a pair of her raiders. Confused by the presence of the Vault Dweller, she angrily demanded to meet with David Thorpe. When she learned that Thorpe wasn't coming, she wanted to know who the Vault Dweller was, telling them that if they were a settler, they were trespassing on her people's land. When the Vault Dweller revealed that they were once a dweller of Vault 76, she seemed even more dismissive than when she had believed that the Vault Dweller was a settler. When confronted with the fact that the 76ers had cleared the way for the raiders to return, she showed a brief glimpse of appreciation. The Vault Dweller took this as an opportunity to present Meg with a gift she couldn't refuse. Rose had told the Vault Dweller about David's trophy, a symbol of Thorpe's power that Rosalind Jeffries had crafted for her love. The presentation of this lost symbol of authority to Meg had the desired effect of ingratiating the Vault Dweller to her, and thus she decided to hear them out. The Vault Dweller started this audience by gauging her intentions when it came to Appalachia, and it was clear that her goal was to conquer the region. They were the sole survivors of the land, and just because they'd stepped out to survive, it didn't mean that they were giving it up. While Margie McClintock might have been on board with multiple parties controlling the region, Meg wasn't so inclined. The Vault Dweller attempted to explain the seriousness of the situation that Meg and her people had walked into. While it was true that the Scorched Beast Queen was dead, the Scorched Plague was still a deadly threat to anyone who wasn't inoculated against it. When the Vault Dweller attempted to discuss the plague, Meg didn't want to hear anything they had to say. In her mind, if you didn't experience the misery caused by the Scorched Plague the first time around, you didn't get to have an opinion on the matter. Besides, the inoculation was bogus. The responders had been trying to get people to aid them in making one 7 to 8 years prior, and it had been a swindle then too. Just a way to fleece people out of their valuable resources. In Meg's mind, everyone was out for themselves, and the responders had been no different. She had her own plans for the Scorched, and she revealed that she had dispatched a party of fighters to battle them just south of Crater. The Vault Dweller was taken aback by this foolish act. They had spent the past year poring over the ruins of pre-scorching society, where this exact tactic had failed time and time again. The Vault Dweller explained this to Meg, and again tried to get her on board with the inoculation program. Through impressing her with use of medical terminology such as synthetic antibodies, resilience, and efficacy, Meg began to believe the 76ers inoculation might be the real deal. When confronted about her outdated tactics, she agreed to call her force back and issue the inoculation when it arrived. The Vault Dweller returned to the Overseer's headquarters and told her that the newcomers were willing to accept the inoculation once available. Luckily, the Overseer was already cooking up a plan for distribution. They were going to mass produce the med at the Kanawa Nuka-Cola bottling plant. The Overseer and the Vault Dweller traveled to the plant, and after battling the local feral ghoul population, they arrived at the beverage formulation system. Using synthetic antibodies produced from the inoculated blood of the Vault Dweller, they produced a new variety of America's favorite soda to distribute to the thirsty masses. Nuka-Cola, My Blood's in It. Freshly bottled cases of the inoculant soda were soon rolling down the line, ready for distribution to the newly arrived wastelanders of Appalachia. The Vault Dweller traveled to Crater and met with Meg at the heart of the Crater core. Though she was initially skeptical of the soda the Vault Dweller brought, a little more medical jargon was enough to convince her to distribute the inoculation to her raiders. With the inoculation delivered, the Vault Dweller left the crater. While Nuka-Cola, My Blood's in It had now made Appalachia far safer for the raiders, along with the other wastelanders that had taken part in the inoculation program, the rumors of the treasure vault persisted, without any news to speak of, until the Vault Dweller returned to the crater, that was. When the Vault Dweller had last left Crater, they had traveled back to Sutton, and met with the Overseer once more. There they discussed the rumored treasure vault of Appalachia. Shortly before the Wastelanders had returned to Appalachia, the Vault Dweller had been investigating a strange series of notes related to the Grafton pawnshop once owned by Flavia Stabo. Stabo had disappeared before the bombs, lost while investigating strange stories that pointed to a massive clandestine operation taking place north of Berkeley Springs. These stories ranged from the mundanities of inexplicably heavy shipments traveling to the area, to several suspicious deaths in the area, even all the way up to the supposed Chinese spy Shanghai Sally, who fled Berkeley Springs and led the authorities on a multi-thousand-mile chase across the country. All of this led the Vault Dweller to the hidden entrance of Vault 79. The door of the vault was sealed shut, and despite the rumored treasure within, there was nothing concrete on the details of its contents. Though the Vault Dweller had exhausted their own leads, the Overseer had an idea. When she'd been a student at Vault-Tec University, there'd been a rumored secret restricted wing within the bowels of the university. It was said that this wasn't just some teacher's lounge or school archive. This was a place where the executives of Vault-Tec would meet with government officials and military officers. If such a place existed, there was a chance that it might have the information they needed. Together, the Overseer and the Vault Dweller traveled to VTU, and they found the secret restricted wing. Within, they found a film presentation dedicated to Vault 79. The story it revealed was that the rumored treasure wasn't just real, it was beyond any realistic expectation. The vault's number wasn't a coincidence. 79 is the atomic number of the material it safeguarded, gold. While this was a promising start, it was soon made clear that the gold this vault held was the entirety of America's gold reserves formerly held at Fort Knox. This massive stockpile of gold had been intended to serve as the backing for a new American economy in the aftermath of the war. 26 years after the bombs, it was clear that things were not going according to that plan, but this massive accumulation of material wealth could still be of use. For that to happen, though, they were first going to need to get into the vault, and that wasn't something the Overseer and the Vault Dweller could do on their own. They were going to need help. The Vault Dweller returned to Meg, bringing the truth about the vault, seeking her assistance in gaining access to the treasure within. This was a welcome offer, and though she joked about simply killing the Vault Dweller and taking the plans to the vault, she struck a deal. The raiders would supply the manpower, the Vault Dwellers would supply the location. They would split the loot of the vault amongst them. While this was all nice in theory, they still needed a way into the vault. For that, Meg pointed the Vault Dweller to Lucky Lou, their in-house explosives expert. On the day of the bombs, Lou was a 70-year-old demolitions engineer living in Pittsburgh. It's said that a bomb landed in his living room and didn't go off, hence the honorific Lucky, a name that would continue to prove itself right as he managed to dodge events that would normally kill a person again and again. Though he survived the day of the war, the bombs would change him forever. When the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers flushed residue from the bombs down to Pittsburgh, a lot of people died of radiation poisoning. But some, like Lou, transformed into ghouls. When he joined up with Meg's raiders, the now 96-year-old ghoul became one of her most trusted friends. Despite having lived as a ghoul for over a quarter of a century, Lou had never quite adapted to his new face and voice, and thus he generally kept out of sight. Once the raiders had arrived at Crater, he had taken up residence in one of the rooms below the crater core. When the Vault Dweller went to discuss Lou's role in the upcoming raid on Vault 79, they found nothing but a note. The note stated that he was gone forever, and it named Fisher, one of the Crater Raiders, as his sole beneficiary. The Vault Dwellers searched the crater core until they came across the Fisher mentioned in the note. Before the war, Caleb Fisher had been part of an isolated Amish community, and because of this, he still spoke with a Germanic accent. Though he had once been a true believer, he had lost his faith with the war. When given the opportunity to take his Rumspringa, he left home for good. He joined up with a group of raiders that served under Lev. When Lev joined his group to Meg's group, Fisher came along too. He was Crater's engineer, working to provide clean drinking water and repair the old space station's useful tech. He was generally polite and well liked by the Crater Raiders. When the Vault Dweller spoke to him, Fisher was initially reticent to let anything about his friend Lou slip, but they managed to convince him to spill the beans. Fisher explained that it seemed that Lou, in a fit of melancholy, had gone off on his own. He had asked Fisher to not reveal his departure to anyone. Despite going along with this request for the most part, Fisher had sent his friend Weasel after Lou. Weasel was a good tracker, and Fisher hoped that she would bring Lou home safe. Unfortunately, she had yet to return, but Fisher had placed an electronic tracker on her so that he could find her if something happened. He shared the signal band on which the tracking beacon pulsed, allowing the Vault Dweller to track down Weasel, and hopefully Lou. The Vault Dweller left the crater and followed the beacon to Carlton Mine. Upon entering the mine, the Vault Dweller was greeted by Weasel, a young woman wearing an odd, flashing collar who spoke with a strange voice. Weasel had once been a Blood Eagle raider, until she was caught ratting out one of her comrades, and they burnt her vocal cords with a red-hot poker. After this, she was found by Meg and her raiders, and they took her in. Caleb Fisher took pity upon Weasel and sought to find a way to let her speak. He found the solution in the laboratory of the Monongah-based scientist, Dr. Eddie Harrison. Dr. Harrison had been developing a means of speaking with animals, and Fisher adapted that technology to at least partially restore Weasel's ability to speak. When she could finally tell them what she had done to be made mute, they gave her the epithet Weasel, and Fisher programmed her collar so that it was the only word she could use to refer to herself. Regardless of that, though, both she and the Vault Dweller had come seeking Lou, and according to Weasel, he was somewhere deeper in the mine. Together, the Vault Dweller and Weasel moved ahead looking for Lou. They soon came across an intercom through which they could speak with him. Lou wasn't happy that he had visitors, as he didn't want them getting hurt. He had decided to kill himself by collapsing the mine around him, and he was working on getting the detonator ready as he warned Weasel and the Vault Dweller to leave. Despite the Vault Dweller's best effort to speak with him, Lou wasn't listening, and he shut the intercom off to close the conversation. While the passage ahead was blocked and it seemed for a moment like a dead end, Weasel had an idea. They could blast a weak spot in the wall separating them from the rest of the mine, and thus gain access to the next tunnel. Over the next hour or so, Weasel and the Vault Dweller battled through the mine, trying their best to reach Lou before he could succeed in ending his life. Along the way, Weasel battled the programming of her voice collar, trying workarounds to a limited vocabulary and a block on swear words. They discovered spots where Lou's legendary luck had previously prevented him from killing himself, and the reason he was attempting to do it in the first place. In the 25 years or so since he'd become a ghoul, Lou had battled his fair share of feral ghouls. His greatest fear was that someday he would succumb to whatever had driven his animalistic brethren to madness and attack his friends. When confronted directly by the Vault Dweller, Lou was surrounded by explosive charges rigged to support columns. He explained that even if his luck meant that the explosion didn't kill him, he'd be sealed up and unable to hurt his friends if he turned. When the Vault Dweller continued to press him, reminding him that he had people at Crater that depended on him, Lou suggested that he would only help with the Vault 79 job if the Vault Dweller would help him kill himself afterwards. The Vault Dweller only promised not to interfere if he attempted this again, but that was enough to get Lou on board. With that, the heist had its demolition specialist, and the Vault Dweller returned to Crater to meet with Meg and continue the planning process. When the Vault Dweller arrived in the Crater core, they told Meg that Lou was on board, keeping his suicide attempt a secret as requested. Meg was happy that they now had their way in the front door, but she was starting to have some serious misgivings about the level of security once they made their way in. The vault had been specially built to hold America's gold reserves, and it had received special attention when it came to the automated security systems. The Raiders were going to need some serious firepower if they were going to overcome that obstacle. They were going to need Gale. The 7-foot-tall mountain of muscle, Gale was the resident super mutant of Crater. Unlike the standard super mutants one might find in the wasteland, Gale was generally coherent and reasonable. The Vault Dweller found her in her usual room in the crater core, but her crying made it clear that something was very wrong. When the Vault Dweller tried to check on her, she cried out that she needed help and no one was listening to her. When the Vault Dweller finally managed to calm Gale, she explained that Ra-Ra, the little girl she took care of, was missing. Ever since they'd first met, Gale and Ra-Ra had been inseparable, with Gale serving as Ra-Ra's surrogate mother and guardian, and Ra-Ra as a surrogate daughter for Gale. Ra-Ra and Gale had been out by Grafton Steel when something stole Ra-Ra's stuffed rabbit, Bunabun. Ra-Ra chased after it, running down a pipe into the bowels of Grafton Steel. She was soon trapped by the mill's automated security robots and unable to escape. Gale had wanted to chase after her, but she couldn't fit in the pipe. She waited outside for Ra-Ra to return, but after a long time with no sign of her, she returned to the crater to get help. It was at once clear to the Vault Dweller that Gale wasn't going to be a part of any heist until Ra-Ra was safe. And far more importantly, there was a little girl missing and in danger. The Vault Dweller charged off to Grafton Steel as fast as they could. After following Ra-Ra's path of ways, the Vault Dweller came in contact with the mill's robotic security. After killing off the robots, Ra-Ra emerged from her hiding place in a nearby vent. As much as the Vault Dweller might have wanted to take Ra-Ra back out the way they came, she wasn't going anywhere without her Bunabun. The two of them advanced through Grafton Steel together, with the Vault Dweller battling the security robots while Ra-Ra climbed through the vents, opening otherwise inoperable doors. Finally, they found Bunabun next to the corpse of a rat that stole the stuffed rabbit in the first place. Unfortunately, the rat hadn't dropped dead of its own accord, and the Vault Dweller was soon beset by a powerful sentry bot. The Vault Dweller battled the bot, dodging minigun fire and rockets. Ra-Ra aided them from above, dropping grenades for the Vault Dweller to use against the bot. When the robot was reduced to scrap, the Vault Dweller and Ra-Ra left the mill and returned to Crater. Gale was thrilled to have Ra-Ra back, and Meg was happy that someone had stopped to help. With Ra-Ra home safe, Gale joined the heist as a heavy weapons specialist, but the team still wasn't complete. The Vault's security wasn't going to simply be limited to turrets and robots that Gale could blast, but electronically sealed doors. They were going to need a security expert, and for that, Meg pointed the Vault Dweller to Gentleman Johnny Two Guns Weston. The Vault Dweller found Johnny Weston in his room in the crater core, where he stood out in his trademark immaculate black suit. A consummate con man, Johnny Weston grew up in a military family that he lost contact with by the time of the war. He did have one friend left from the time before the bombs though, Hal Gleason. He and Hal had wandered the wastes together in the aftermath of the war until they came across Meg's gang. Johnny infiltrated Meg's raiders, simply playing the part of one of her people until he was revealed to be a fraud weeks later. After that, he continued to work with them, eventually shifting to working more and more for Meg. Over that time, they instigated a physical relationship that they maintain to this day. Johnny and Hal split up after the founding of Crater, with Johnny hanging around while Hal went his own way. While Johnny was interested in the heist, he had some personal business he needed help with. He had recently discovered that Hal was in trouble. A group of raiders had ventured into Watoga where they staged arena fights in the old Civic Center. Meg had asked Johnny to investigate these new arrivals to see if they were potential allies, but it quickly became clear that they were slavers, and amongst their chattel was Johnny's partner Hal. Together, Johnny and the Vault Dweller were going to get Hal out, and Johnny had a plan. He was going to pass the Vault Dweller off as his slave and enter them in one of the arena fights where they'd be forced to combat feral ghouls or some other creatures. Once the Vault Dweller was in the slave quarters, they would break Hal out and escape together. In order to ensure that the Vault Dweller would win the fight, Johnny would provide some assistance, rigging the fight in their favor. Though the Vault Dweller wasn't thrilled with the potential consequences that might come with failure, they agreed to the plan in order to get Johnny on board. The two of them traveled to Watoga separately and met up at the Civic Center. Once there, the Vault Dweller found Johnny Weston disguised as Reginald P. Humphreys, a character of his own creation. After a quick and quiet greeting, Johnny guided the Vault Dweller loudly into the locker rooms. When confronted by the guard at the entrance about the Vault Dweller not wearing the requisite slave collar, Johnny passed it off as a result of intestinal trouble. Typical slave collars contained a bomb that could be detonated if the slave attempted to escape, attacked the audience, or came in last place in the competition. Johnny's disgusting claim was enough to fluster the guard out of examining it properly, just as Johnny had planned. In a darkened corner, Johnny affixed a disarmed bomb collar to the Vault Dweller. The Vault Dweller would be fighting in 3 rounds. If everything went according to plan, there was no reason to fear that the arena staff would attempt to detonate the collar. If they did though, the failure of the collar to explode would be an obvious sign that something was up, and the plan would switch over to kill everyone but Hal and escape. When the Vault Dweller requested that Johnny treat him with a little more dignity, he agreed to change their fighter name from Septic Survivor to Atomic Avenger, but he cautioned to not let ego get in the way of a successful operation. The Vault Dweller fought through 3 rounds of foes, starting with feral ghouls before moving on to floaters, and finally a Grafton monster. In each round, Johnny offered to help them in some way, which provided some definite assistance to the Vault Dweller's success. After 3 successful fights, Johnny sold the Vault Dweller to the arena boss, Sargento, and they drank from the sedative-laced Winner's Cup. When the Vault Dweller woke in a VIP box next to Hal Gleason, the plan moved into the next stage. The Vault Dweller revealed to Hal that they were there with Johnny Weston to free him, and he was pleasantly surprised. He'd been planning to escape the following night, but given that help had arrived, he concluded the time was right. He'd dug a tunnel through the dilapidated wall of the arena and hidden it with a bookcase. Together, the Vault Dweller and Hal snuck out of the room and down to the arena floor where Johnny was waiting in disguise. While the Vault Dweller battled a pair of guards that discovered their escape, Johnny gunned down Hal. After the Vault Dweller fought off the remainder of the guards, they spoke with Johnny Weston. He explained that on their last job together, Hal had ripped him off and taken way more than his fair share of the loot. Johnny hadn't discovered Hal's malfeasance until after he had already left Crater. He killed Hal to send the message that no one steals from him. Despite his determination to carry out this act of revenge, and his attempt to maintain his usual cool demeanor, it was clear that he regretted this killing almost immediately. Before they left the arena, Johnny tried to get a 50% cut of the gang's share of the loot from the Vault 79 raid. The Vault Dweller countered with a firm 25% offer, and Johnny agreed. With that, they left the arena and returned to Crater. The crew was assembled, and the heist could finally kick off. Meg dispatched the Vault Dweller to Vault 79, where Lucky Lou was in the process of planting the explosives around the door. The rest of the raiders would depart shortly after. The Vault Dweller made their way to the secret cave entrance of the vault, entered the code obtained from the work of Flavia Stabo, and descended to the vault entrance. What they found there was not anything they'd planned for. Lou, tied to a post, next to a sleeping bear. The Vault Dweller took care of the bear as quickly as possible and freed Lou from his bindings. Lou explained how he'd ended up in his predicament. This was the work of Lev, one of the upper members of the Raiders of the Crater. An immigrant and a mobster from Soviet Russia, he had come to America before the war and found Americans to be soft, easy prey. In the aftermath of the bombs, he had formed his own raider gang. Eventually, this gang was absorbed by Meg's raiders, and because of his past leadership, he viewed himself as Meg's second-in-command. While Meg was welcoming of mutants like Gale and ghouls like Lou, Lev despised mutated humans, and he hated Meg's welcoming stance to all. Lou surmised that somehow Lev had heard about the heist plans, because he didn't come here just to kill Lou. He had stolen the detonator they needed to access the vault. Unfortunately, Lev wasn't alone. He had some of his old crew with him, specifically Serge and Caleb Fisher, among others. Serge was a marksman, and an incredibly skilled one at that. Though she was initially raised and trained by her survivalist father, she ended up wandering the wastes alone after heart disease took him from her. She had seen Lev battling super mutants through her scope, and decided she needed to get to know him better. While she shared Lev's hatred of mutants, Fisher did not. He was a good friend of Lou's, but he felt loyalty to Lev from their time before joining Meg, and this is what brought him on board. The Vault Dweller was now faced with 3 problems: Lev's betrayal, his theft of the detonator, and his gang's subsequent disappearance. The most important thing to do was to alert Meg to the situation. The Vault Dweller left Lou behind to finish placing the explosives, and they returned to Crater. Meg was already suspicious that something was up, thanks to Lev's unexplained disappearance. When informed of the situation at Vault 79, she realized the scope of the problem, and further, that their differing views on mutants was probably a big part of this. Meg saw the benefits of having people around with the experience of Lou and the strength of Gale. Lev saw them as freaks. As mad as she was, she couldn't help noticing the irony of Lev running off with some of her crew, just as she had done with some of Margie's. Although I think it has to be said that it seems like Margie was already dead by the time Meg ran off. That said, Meg's most immediate concern was the likely presence of a mole within her organization, and she set the Vault Dweller on the hunt to find Lev's man on the inside. She gave the Vault Dweller 3 places to start the investigation: Axel, Creed, and Barb, the last people seen talking to Lev. These 3 made sense to investigate as a unit, as they were all interconnected. Axel was the guard at Crater's southern entrance, watching people come and go. He was said to be honest unless he was looking out for a loved one, in which case he would normally take the fall for them. He was best friends with Creed and a boyfriend to Barb. Creed was considered to be a wimp by most of the Crater Raiders, as he didn't like to raid. Besides that, he was a pushover who couldn't maintain a lie under pressure. That said, he was best friends with Axel, and was a very supportive brother to his sister, Barb. Barb was very different from Creed, and she was generally embarrassed by her brother, in spite of his support for her. She would even go so far as to refer to Creed as Axel's best friend rather than as my brother. She had also once killed a dog at Crater just because it annoyed her, and had gotten away with it because she was a skilled liar. Meg liked Barb, but she recognized that Barb was more focused on self-preservation than loyalty to others, Meg included. She would lie to protect herself and snitch on others if it meant taking them down. Along with these three suspects, Meg suggested that the Vault Dweller check with Molly, Crater's bartender. Barb told the Vault Dweller that she had overheard their conversation with Meg and was ready to clear her name. She told him that she didn't think Axel was the mole because Lev would never trust him with something important. She did, however, implicate her brother as Lev's mole, this while telling the Vault Dweller how embarrassed of him she was for him being a wimp and a coward. Having heard of his gentle disposition and inability to lie under pressure, the Vault Dweller took a bad cop approach with Creed. Creed revealed that he and Barb had been part of Lev's crew before they joined up with Meg. He also confirmed that he wasn't much of a raiding raider, choosing instead to work on Crater. He detailed how he had cared for his sister after his parents had died, and noted that she was something of a troublemaker, a liar, and a snitch. That said, he didn't believe that she would be Lev's mole, as Lev used to make unwanted passes at her until Meg had gotten him to stop. When pressed, he revealed he didn't know if Barb was working with Lev or not, as they didn't speak much, but he proclaimed his own innocence. As for Axel, Creed's first reaction was to ask if he had taken the fall for Barb again, confirming the impression given by Meg that he would rather take the fall than see someone else suffer. Creed then attempted to shift the blame from Barb to Axel, before revealing that he also didn't know whether Axel was working for Lev or not. He did, however, detail his own disgust for Lev, suggesting that he would kill him if he had the chance. Wanting to cut to the chase, and assuming that Axel would just take the blame as he always did, the Vault Dweller went to Molly's bar. Molly had a hard childhood in pre-war South Boston, living with military checkpoints, trigger-happy cops, and under the crime lord Eddie Winter. It was so bad that she found that she preferred tending bar for raiders in the post-apocalypse. She'd once been one of 3 bartenders alongside Lex and Pretty Pete. When Lex overdosed on her own stash, Pretty Pete was so distraught that he drunkenly wandered into a bat fissure, leaving Molly as the lone bartender. Intent on not following the lead of her former co-workers, she lives a life of sobriety. After charging the Vault Dweller a bribe for information, she told them explicitly that Barb was the mole they were after. It seems that Lev and Barb had discussed the topic just outside her bar and weren't aware they were being overheard. With witness testimony in hand, the Vault Dweller returned to Barb. While Barb initially tried to claim that there was no way Molly could have overheard them, the Vault Dweller was ready with a bargain. Confess, or let Meg decide what to do with this information. Barb replied to this offer with a hypothetical situation. Supposing she was the mole and confessed, Meg would kill or exile her. If Meg exiled her, Lev would find and kill her. Either way, she would be dead. The Vault Dweller had a compromise. Tell them where Lev was, and they would kill Lev. No need to tell Meg. This was amenable to Barb, and she told the Vault Dweller that Lev was in one of the cooling towers at the Poseidon Energy Plant in Charleston, building a hideout. He had offered to pay Barb if she would tell him when Meg sent anyone after him. The Vault Dweller told Barb that her secret was safe with them so long as she dropped her connection to Lev. Any further sign of treachery, and they would kill her themselves. With the lead in hand, the Vault Dweller made the trek down to Charleston and the Poseidon Energy Plant. Built in the 1970s as a coal-fired power plant, the facility had been in the process of being updated to ultrasonic reactors when the bombs came down. Lev was located in the oldest cooling tower, in a section of the plant that hadn't been renovated. The Vault Dweller broke in and killed half a dozen raiders and their attack dogs before they arrived at the cooling tower itself. After a firefight with another half dozen raiders, the Vault Dweller was forced to take out Serge and Caleb Fisher. Though they'd only been just acquainted with Serge, Caleb had been kind to the Vault Dweller. At the center of the cooling tower, the Vault Dweller found Lev. Despite his predicament, he was just as insulting and dismissive as ever. He greeted the Vault Dweller as the Vault Cockroach. As they conversed, the Vault Dweller got to know Lev for the first time, and what they learned wasn't good. Lev had a dark view of the new world, a world in which the strong would rule and the weak would serve. Ghouls like Lou were simply walking corpses, and like their inanimate brethren, they deserved death. While it may have been disheartening to hear that the might makes right philosophy was returning to the world, it wasn't terribly shocking. What was unexpected was the discovery that Lev had been paid by a man from Foundation named Rocco to steal the detonator. He could have simply taken over the Vault 79 heist and stolen the gold himself, but he didn't want gold. He wanted more immediately usable goods like guns, ammo, food, and information, all of which were contained in Rocco's payment. While he could have also found these items in the vault was also a high-security government site with high-tech turrets and robots. By working for Rocco, he got all that he wanted with far less trouble, and it would serve as the perfect start for an attack on the Settlement Foundation. When given the opportunity to defend his actions, he would not. He claimed that were he in the Vault Dweller's position, he would simply kill them, not talk them to death. When offered exile from Appalachia and his life, he refused, saying that he wasn't a coward. After a short gun battle, Lev was dead. Around the cooling tower, the Vault Dweller found 3 holotapes. 2 for Meg, 1 for Lou. Meg's tapes were from Lev and Serge. Both extolled their belief that Meg was a terrible leader and that someday the mutants she allowed in would kill them all. This was fairly ironic, seeing as how the biggest risk to the Crater Raiders had just shown itself to be unmutated bigots. Fisher's tape for Lou also detailed the lack of faith in Meg, but it was singular in its lack of hatred for ghouls, as he apologized to Lou. Fisher also explained that this had been the plan from the start. Lev had never intended to be the number 2 in the Crater Raiders forever, but Meg kept hiring, and soon there were too many to overwhelm. Both Fisher and Lev made the claim that the final straw that made them separate themselves from their brethren at Crater was the introduction of the Vault Dweller and their plan to raid Vault 79. Both Lev and Fisher viewed it as foolishness that would lead them to ruin. Before returning to Crater, the Vault Dweller needed to track down Lev's benefactor. They traveled to Foundation and spoke with Ward. Ward wasn't terribly happy to see the Crater-associated Vault Dweller, but he was willing to talk regardless. When asked about Rocco, Ward explained that Rocco had been banished from Foundation for sowing discord all over town. He would rile residents up against each other, and then steal their guns and ammo from them when they weren't paying attention. Luckily for the Vault Dweller, the settlers were keeping track of Rocco in case he caused more trouble, so Ward was able to direct the Vault Dweller to him. The Vault Dweller followed Ward's guidance and found Rocco in the boat rental office on Spruce Knob Lake. When confronted, Rocco explained that he had done what he did to get back in Foundation's good graces by derailing the Raider attempt to gain access to Vault 79. The Vault Dweller gave him the same offer they'd given to Lev: permanent exile from Appalachia. He accepted, and the Vault Dweller left him to gather his meager belongings and flee. With the Lev affair closed, the Vault Dweller returned to Meg at Crater. The Vault Dweller decided to keep their word to Barb and didn't tell Meg about her betrayal, keeping their comments to Lev's crimes on the behalf of Rocco. Though she wasn't thrilled that Rocco was still breathing, she was glad it was over. She explained her tolerance of Lev's intolerance by telling the Vault Dweller that, in spite of his awful attitude, Lev was a very reliable operator. That said, she claimed she would do a better job in the future of weeding out bigots. She was upset that Fisher was dead, as he was a big part of why Crater operated as well as it did. She was less upset about the loss of Serge. While Serge had been their best lookout, they could get by without her. With the mutiny crushed, they were ready for Vault 79 once more. They departed separately and made their way to the vault. A few hours later, the Vault Dweller met with Meg, Lou, Gale, Rara, and Johnny before the thick exterior door of the Great Treasure Vault. After a quick greeting that fluttered on the fringes of a discussion of ED, they were ready to go. When given the go-ahead, Lou set off the charges in a superbly controlled demolition that blew the vault door out of its housing. As Johnny and Gale began the assault with Rara in tow, Meg pulled the Vault Dweller aside for a discussion. She told him that she was going to guard the entrance and make sure no one followed them inside, but she also requested that the Vault Dweller keep an eye on Johnny. His 25% cut wasn't making her happy, and she wanted to make sure that he pulled his weight. Beyond this, they discussed how Lou would be spending the next few hours reinforcing the door to prevent collapse, and how in spite of the danger, Rara would be safe with Gale. Leaving Meg to guard the entrance, the Vault Dweller entered the vault. The foyer was a mess, and somehow Gale and Johnny had missed a few turrets. After dealing with these dangerous remnants, the Vault Dweller advanced deeper in. There were dead robots all over the place, surely a sign of the advance of Gale. Eventually, the Vault Dweller found Gale, Rara, and Johnny stopped at a sealed door. The Vault Dweller found a way to open the door as Gale and Rara tormented Johnny. With the door open, the party, sans the Vault Dweller, continued their advance. The Vault Dweller chased them only to find themselves hitting a wall of lead spit at them by turrets and robots that the rest of the party had ignored. After a hard-fought battle, the Vault Dweller advanced towards the rest of the party and found them trapped. It seems that in a past life, Johnny Weston had attempted to break into the New York Federal Reserve and, in the process, became a felon. This vault used a similar biometric system and it recognized Johnny. While Johnny was going to have a hard time beating the system, Gale being biometrically scanned might give them a chance to get out of their situation. Gale climbed into the scanner and started to add her profile to the system. When the system couldn't check Vault-Tech's central servers, it redirected the connection to the local auxiliary server in the Vault's command center. When this connection was completed, a voice came over the intercom. That of Agent in Charge, Derek Garrison, or AC for short. AC started to question Gale as to her purpose in the vault, and it rapidly became clear that there was a problem with the intercom. This worked to the advantage of the Raiders, as Gale wasn't the most eloquent speaker, and AC assumed they were having technical problems, rather than he was speaking to a massive mutant woman. Through this conversation, the Raider party learned that the vault was in distress and had been for some time. AC invited the team to meet at an auxiliary command center and opened the way forward. After fighting through a dozen turrets and robots, the party arrived in the atrium. Here, the automated security triggered again, and the party was forced to fight more robots and turrets. This fight culminated with the emergence of a massive Annihilator Sentry Bot Mark II. When the last of the security was dealt with, Ra-Ra found a vent like those she had used at Grafton Steel. She used this vent to bypass the security and enter the Overseer's office. Once there, she used the terminal to open security doors in the atrium as security responded, attacking the rest of the party in the atrium. With the security again defeated, the team pushed into the residential section. Once again, the team was forced to battle more robots, this time as they pushed past a handful of bunk rooms. Here, Ra-Ra found a supply room with a powerful plasma rifle and climbed through the vent to give the Vault Dweller access. With a slug buster in hand, the team arrived at the entrance to the Auxiliary Operations Center. Ra-Ra again opened the door, and they found themselves face to face with a man in a dark suit and sunglasses. He had the appearance of a government agent, which was fitting as he and all the other dwellers in the vault were members of the Secret Service. AC approached the glass and explained the situation. They were there to protect the gold until the government came to claim it. They'd been doing maintenance 3 months prior when the reactor malfunctioned and half the population had been killed or converted into ghouls. In the small section of the vault they still had access to, they were running out of water and food. The Secret Service made a deal with the party. They would grant them access to the gold if they restored power to the reactor. This was a deal of practicality, if nothing else, as the gold was inaccessible without power. With the vast majority of the fighting over, Gale decided that it was time for her to escort Ra-Ra out of the vault. Together, the Vault Dweller and Johnny Weston made their way to the reactor. At its entrance, they found another man in a black suit and sunglasses, but in this case, he was also a ghoul. Despite this, he wasn't hostile. Agent Chase, or Digger as he was known, had become a sentient ghoul. He explained the situation. The reactor was stable but offline, and as long as the ambient radiation in the chamber remained as high as it was, there was no getting it back online. Along with this, the reactor was swarming with feral ghouls that were once Digger's co-workers. Digger had considered venting the chamber to clear the radiation, but he feared that the additional radiation would turn him feral. The Vault Dweller donned a radiation-resistant outfit, and they made their way to the control room, fighting when they couldn't sneak past the ghouls and wendigos. Once in the control room, they activated the emergency ventilation, cleansing the room of radiation. With the radiation cleared, the reactors came back online, and the security system rebooted. The ghouls that were up and about were gone quickly. Rather than let the security turrets then turn on them, the Vault Dweller then turned to the turrets hostile to all targets. The primary result of this was to have the turrets destroy each other, rather than the Assaultron Dominator that was also patrolling the floor. Unfortunately, they also missed the comatose but very much alive feral ghouls that surrounded the reactor cores. In the end, the Vault Dweller and Johnny Weston defeated the security and the ghouls and were able to enter the gold processing room. Here they found hundreds of ingots of gold, and it was then that Johnny Weston turned on the Vault Dweller. Despite all they'd been through together, and the fact that he was already getting a large cut of the gold, Johnny Weston thought he could just kill the Vault Dweller and take their share as well. Luckily for both of them, the Vault Dweller had a card to play: guilt. Killing Hal, who had wronged him, had been very hard on Johnny. Killing the Vault Dweller, who had done nothing but help him, would have caused him more regret. Beyond this, the Vault Dweller did what they could to pull him out of this mindset that he had to kill to get respect, as he already had it. Johnny and the Vault Dweller agreed to let bygones be bygones, and they got to work securing the gold. With their loot in hand, they returned to the Secret Service security station, taking Digger with them. At the checkpoint, the agents nearly fired on Digger until the Vault Dweller explained the nature of ghouls to AC and secured Digger a place with his old companions. With that wrapped up, the conversation turned to the gold carried by the Vault Dweller and Johnny. The Secret Service still wanted the gold, but they weren't going to take it from them. They offered a trade: gold for advanced military schematics. They wanted to enact the original plan for the Vault, establishing a new currency for the United States, rebuilding the economy, and with it, the country. Regardless of the desires of the Vault Dweller, it wasn't just their gold to trade. A lot of it, half at least, was the property of the Raiders. AC told them that if they changed their minds, they could come see them, and provided them with a key for easier access to the safe section of the vault. With that, they all walked to the Gold Vault Operations Center, and discovered that what they had found in the transfer room was a drop in the ocean of the real supply. It was here in the Gold Vault Operations Center that Meg finally joined the Vault Dweller and Johnny Weston. The Vault Dweller handed the Raiders their half of the gold, celebrated their success with Johnny and Meg, and then took some time to gaze and wonder at the majesty of the view. Over the next few months, Appalachia entered a short-lived period of peace. In this time, Mortimer the Robot arrived at Crater to deal with the gold trade that began as a result of the events at Vault 79. The Vault Dwellers spent a good deal of time with their former heist members and helped the locals with a few missions of their own. Rin, an 18-year-old raider who was born and raised with the Diehards, maintained and operated Crater's electronic communication systems. Thanks to the terrible environment of the Toxic Valley, she had a need for a constant supply of new parts to keep the equipment going, a need that the Vault Dweller would fulfill now and again. Along with this, the Vault Dweller assisted Roxy, a raider in charge of hunting down former members of the Raiders of the Crater. It wasn't as though the Crater Raiders were a group in which one was forced to remain for life, but if an individual joined, consumed a bunch of supplies, and immediately left, they were considered thieves. Roxy's work ensured that people paid into the system if they took out of it, or that they weren't in a position to take from Crater again. She subcontracted this work to other raiders and the Vault Dweller. East of the Savage Divide, a party of Crater Raiders led by Slayer came to occupy the Sunday Brothers' cabin. They used the old Free State site to brew moonshine until the noise produced by the moonshining drew in so many creatures that the raiders at the site were slain. The first sign that the relative peace and the aftermath of the Vault Raid wasn't to last came with a nearly indiscernible message crackling over the radio. It was soon revealed to be the voice of Paladin Layla Romani, head of the Brotherhood 1st Expeditionary Force. The Brotherhood arrived in the fall of 2103 and quickly set themselves up in the old Atlas Observatory building, renaming the site Fort Atlas. Though the promise of order brought by the Brotherhood was welcomed by many, there were those who harbored serious concerns about their ambitions long term. At Crater, the most concerned raiders would form what they called the War Party. At the head of the War Party was Pierce. Charismatic and well-spoken, Pierce would bear any burden to keep Crater and his friends safe. Though he was driven to win, he was also honorable and wouldn't resort to underhanded tactics if he didn't have to in order to survive. Pierce's second in command was Sheena. Sheena handled the strategic thinking of the organization, and just like Pierce, she was fiercely loyal to her friends. Lastly, there was soft-spoken and socially awkward Burke. Burke's stated role in the War Party was to guard places, lift things, and kill people, all of which they would do for their friends without question. Pierce originally met Sheena at Crater before he was captured and held by an unnamed man. Pierce originally met Burke when he was a prisoner of Burke's boss when Burke was working as a guard. As Pierce treated Burke with more respect than their own boss, Burke was drawn to Pierce. When Sheena arrived, the three of them escaped together. Together, these three formed the core of the War Party. Though we don't know exactly how many Crater Raiders were in the War Party, we do know that Pierce claims to have brought a Raider army to Meg to use for one purpose: the defense of Crater through the destruction of the Brotherhood of Steel. Meg agreed to his plans, so long as the consequences of his actions never fell upon Crater. At the northwestern end of Crater, a piece of the station that was upside down and lodged firmly in the ground became the home for the new War Party. Pierce felt that it wouldn't be long before the Brotherhood would start making demands of the other Wastelander organizations, and he wouldn't have to wait long to be proven right. Not long after the Brotherhood arrived in Appalachia, the Raiders of Crater took command of a new site. West of Grafton, they found a small private bunker built by an ex-employee of Vault-Tec who couldn't get space in a real vault for his family. Though the residents of the makeshift vault were long dead, the structure was still intact, and the War Party had a use for this secure storage. They had recently encountered a party of raiders passing through from the west. These raiders claimed to have defeated a heavily armed and armored party of soldiers and claimed some very destructive missile launchers off of them. Missile launchers that carried the Brotherhood of Steel's insignia. The War Party obtained these deadly missile launchers and stored them in their newly acquired bunker. Just as they were properly establishing their presence in the bunker, a couple of Brotherhood initiates stumbled upon their location. Though these scouts ran off without a fight, shortly after another initiate came, and this one was a former dweller of Vault 76. The Dweller Initiate was themselves followed almost immediately by Knight Shin, one of the leaders of the local Brotherhood chapter. Through a quick negotiation between the Dweller Initiate and Pierce, the Brotherhood obtained control of the makeshift vault and all the supplies within. While this was done in the name of securing some truly dangerous weaponry, it was also the exact sign that Pierce needed to know he was right. He invited the Dweller Initiate back to Crater to discuss the source of the Brotherhood's missile launchers in Raider territory. With a makeshift vault secured, the Dweller Initiate was sent to Crater to determine the source of the missile launchers. They met Pierce in the war room, but he refused to speak to them. Sheena saw an opportunity in this situation. She promised the Dweller Initiate information on the source of the launchers if they brought her a copy of the Brotherhood's patrol schedule. The Dweller Initiate returned shortly later with a holotape containing the requested data, and she told them the story of the raiders that traded them the launchers. Unfortunately for Sheena, the data supplied was a well-constructed fake made by the Brotherhood's local head scribe, Scribe Valdez. The Dweller Initiate left Crater once more, and they wouldn't return for about a year. In 2104, a newcomer arrived at the Crater, a young woman named Marcia Leone. Marcia had been part of a community to the west that came under threat from a group of raiders. Though the Brotherhood of Steel 1st Expeditionary Force was passing by at the time and tried to help them fight the raiders won. Marcia and her little brother Maximo were the only survivors. The remaining Brotherhood force escorted the two of them to Appalachia rather than leave them in the smoking ruins where their mother had died. Marcia hated the Brotherhood of Steel for the death of her mother. She reasoned that if the settlers had simply surrendered, they would have been spared. While she lived with the Brotherhood at Fort Atlas for a year, she couldn't take it anymore, and she ran away to Crater. In her view, the raiders were the only force capable of taking on the Brotherhood and their oppression. To assure her entry into the war party of the Raiders of the Crater, she brought with her a gift: intel stolen from the Brotherhood about a potential salvaging site at Atomic Mining Services headquarters in Watoga. Marcia may have despised the Brotherhood, but many at Fort Atlas cared for her and were worried when she disappeared. It wasn't long before someone came looking for her, and as it turned out, it was the Dweller Initiate. They had followed her there on the orders of Scribe Valdez, who was terribly worried for her with all the kidnappings that were taking place across Appalachia at the time. The Dweller Initiate had come to bring her home to Fort Atlas, her brother Maximo, and her friends. Marcia didn't want anything to do with the Dweller Initiate, and she told them to leave. It was clear to the Dweller Initiate, though, that something was wrong, so they inquired. While Pierce was happy to show them the door, Marcia burst with worry. She explained that Sheena and Burke had followed her AMS lead and were now past due on their proper return time. The Dweller Initiate agreed to help her find them and return them safely to Crater without any agreement to return to Fort Atlas. The two of them traveled separately to AMS HQ and met in the lobby. Together, they fought their way through a party of Hellcat mercenaries, eventually finding Sheena and Burke locked in the basement. And the Dweller Initiate took one final shot at convincing Marcia to return. They explained to her how her brother already idolized the Brotherhood. If she wasn't there to guide him, he would end up a bootlicker. This was what finally convinced her to return to Fort Atlas. She said goodbye to her new friends and left the raider life behind. In the aftermath of the Dweller Initiate assisting in the rescue of Sheena and Burke, the two of them returned to the war room where they reunited with Pierce. While Sheena remained hostile to the Dweller Initiate in the aftermath of the rescue, Burke was much more willing to delve into their past. Unfortunately, this olive branch seems not to have ameliorated the hostilities between the Raiders and the Brotherhood. While Pierce promised to avoid firing on Marcia and any attack on the fort, there was no common ground to be had with the Brotherhood at that time. Currently, it seems that the War Party hasn't truly accomplished any of its goals when it comes to the new Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel. Only time will tell if they engage more actively in combat with the Brotherhood in the future. Alright, that just about does it for the narrative, but I have some notes on this topic. First, a little housekeeping. I want to note that I tried to make the part of the video on the diehards as short as possible, given that I've covered them previously in my video on the Raiders of the Crater. If you're interested in those 5 gangs and haven't seen my video covering their story, I recommend you check it out. Along with that, I referred to the player as both the Vault Dweller when covering Wastelanders lore, and the Dweller Initiate when covering Steel Dawn lore. Vault Dweller seems to be the going term for the Vault 76 player characters. I don't particularly like this name, as the player is no longer a Vault Dweller the moment we start playing the game. This isn't like Fallout 1, where one might assume that the player character will eventually return to life in the vault and thus is known as the Vault Dweller. We know we're never going back. I've used former Vault Dweller in the past, but Vault Dweller rolls off the tongue much more easily, which, believe me, makes a difference when you're reading it over 100 times. I used Dweller Initiate in the Steel Dawn lore simply because I'd used that term when referencing the player character in the second Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel video, because I like it more than Vault Dweller, and because it was more specific to the situation. Second, I went through this content on 2 different characters, one in which I supported the Raiders in getting into Vault 79, and one in which I supported the Settlers in getting into Vault 79. I told the story with the most favorable outcomes from both playthroughs. This may not be exactly how you experience the content, because there are many points at which the story can be altered by skill checks and choices. For example, if your intelligence isn't high enough in the encounter with Meg in the mezzanine at the top of the world, the conversation with Meg ends with the player running off to meet her fighters, rather than Meg simply accepting that she needs a different strategy to fight the Scorched. While this at the outset appears to be a big change, in both cases, Meg agrees to distribute the Vault Dweller's inoculation to her followers. The broad strokes of the story are maintained. The only real choice comes with who you take into the vault. Third, as previously mentioned, if Meg doesn't immediately see reason regarding her fight with the Scorched, the player must run off to meet with the raiders she sent to combat the Scorched. Around a trailer near the Philippi Battlefield Cemetery, the Vault Dweller finds the remnants of Meg's fighters, and evidence of their failed battle with the Scorched and Scorched beasts. Within the trailer, the Vault Dweller finds Aldridge, the last living member of the crew. Aldridge is already infected, and he eventually requests that the player put him down. This defeat serves as a poignant message to Meg about the dangers of the Scorched, and she agrees to have her people inoculated. Fourth, there are a handful of crater raiders that didn't fit into the narrative. In a small section of the station, across from the main entrance of the crater core, Irie operates a weapons shop. In a shack nearby, Raph sells armor to his fellow raiders. Not far from Raph's shop sat the trailer home of Munch, Crater's resident historian, or more accurately, Crater's resident disinformation machine. Munch wanted to make history more interesting, and thus he spent his time educating children about how whales were once subterranean animals that dug through the earth making earthquakes and other fantastic revisions. Atop the watchtower to the south of the crater core, Kiyomi served as a guard of the southern advance. A relatively recent addition to the Crater Raiders, she felt her guard duty was a way of paying her dues on her way into the organization. Though she felt that her work was pointless as the very reputation of the Raiders would keep enemies away, her work was appreciated by the higher-ups. It was unlikely that the super mutants from Grafton Steel would fear their reputation. Far south of Crater in Charleston, Nash can be found living in a shack amongst the ruins. While Nash was once a Crater Raider, he left them behind because he felt Meg was getting too soft. His great regret in life was not having been with the Cutthroats when David Thorpe drowned Charleston. Should the Vault Dweller choose to work with the settlers of Foundation rather than the Raiders of Crater, they meet another Crater Raider named Hijack, who has kidnapped Penelope Hornwright. There's another Raider named Kogan that can be found in the Crater Watchpost if Caleb Fisher lies to the Vault Dweller about Lucky Lou's location. That covers the remainder of the Raiders not mentioned in the narrative, but there's a serious question I have about one that was mentioned. Fifth, I'm wondering if Molly killed her competition. If you don't remember exactly who I'm talking about, Molly was once one of 3 bartenders operating in Crater. That changed when Lex, the chem dealer, overdosed on her own supply, and Pretty Pete wandered into a bat fissure. There's nothing concrete that says she had anything to do with it. There's just something in the way she talks about it that makes me wonder if she wasn't responsible in the end, so that she would come out as the only booze and drug slinger in Crater. Sixth, the Raiders of the Crater are very different from the typical Raiders we've seen in Fallout 3 and 4. These Raiders live a more morally gray lifestyle than the Raiders in the previous games. In truth, they feel more like the Great Khans in Fallout New Vegas than the gangs that roam the Capital Wasteland and the Commonwealth. Unlike those gangs that hold up in ruins, making a meager living on what they can take from caravans and settlements, the Crater Raiders are partially capable of sustaining themselves and appear to be working to increase their self-sufficiency. In short, the Raiders of Crater feel more like a group of rough settlers than a raider group. The best contrast to illustrate this point is to compare the Crater Raiders to the Blood Eagles. That said, they are a raider group, and I think nothing symbolizes that better than the mounted heads they keep inside the crater core. That's not something you see in settler homes. As a side note, I can't imagine wanting to do such a thing. Even if you ignore the immorality of killing a person and defiling their corpse, the smell and vermin infestation that would come with the act of mounting heads in your home makes me question the thought processes of raiders. Seventh, it's crazy that the Crater Raiders chose to live at the crashed space station when the forest exists. I have to assume that the choice to settle in the Toxic Valley was made by the developers for 2 reasons. A, they didn't want to mess too dramatically with the starting zone of Fallout 76, and B, Crater looks really cool. As best as I can tell, the crashed space station is responsible for the glowing liquid that has turned the Toxic Valley's water orange. Whatever this stuff is, I can't imagine it not being toxic. While Fisher managed to get the water purification of the space station to clean the water, cleaning the sludge off those filters and simply being around the toxic orange water can't be safe. The ground here is covered in the toxic white dust from Grafton Steel, and the Raiders are trying to grow crops in that. I don't think it takes being a scientist to know that even if something were to grow from that earth, you probably shouldn't eat it. I have to imagine the people of Crater are all going to die fairly young from various cancers induced by their environment. Eighth, it's quite telling that when Rose is creating the holotape of David Thorpe's voice, that negotiate was the one word she didn't have a recording of. I don't know exactly when Rose came into being, but if it wasn't too long after the death of Rosalind, then David Thorpe didn't say the word negotiate in over a decade, or at least not in earshot of Rose. While this isn't an usual everyday word for the average person, David was the head of a large faction, and in a position where negotiate is usually commonplace. I think that this is just another clue as to what kind of man he is, assuming that mass murder of innocents didn't make it clear. Ninth, there's a lot wrong with the space station that became Crater. This could probably be its own video, but I'll try to make it quick. First of all, I've mentioned this before, but I have to say it again. The station is remarkably intact considering it fell to Earth. Impossibly intact, really. Don't get me wrong, I love the site. It's amazing to look at, but it really doesn't make any sense. Space stations are constructed in orbit and are not built to survive re-entry. We've had at least 12 stations that have fallen to Earth in our history, and all were reduced to barely discernible scrap by the time they reached the ground. Space Shuttle Columbia broke up on re-entry, and that was a vessel that was intended for re-entry. All it took was a few damaged thermal tiles, and it was brought to ruin. Even assuming that it would pass through the atmosphere this intact, how did it not shatter into a million pieces on hitting the ground? I have to question the massive arc of the station that looms over the site. Second, it seems like there's more space station material here than there should be at Crater. My original conception of this structure in the version that I discussed in the narrative was that it was a wheel-like structure, and that the rim of the wheel was connected to the central hub via 6 spoke-like tunnels. Basically what I've drawn up here. The problem with this concept is that there's far more rim than necessary to complete a single wheel. While the crater core has 6 spoke tunnel connection points, the large rim segment and the little bits here and there have a total of 10 to 12 of their own corresponding connection points. Based on this, the station was at least a combination of 2 wheels, and that's assuming that the majority of the space station fell here in the Toxic Valley. It could well be that debris from the space station lies across hundreds if not thousands of miles of wasteland. The aforementioned Space Shuttle Columbia left behind a 645-mile-long debris trail. So basically, we either have too many segments of the station to match what it was, or no conception of the original station's structure. Third, there are problems with the station's construction. Primarily, we're looking at the walkways on the floor of the interior of the station. The placement of these doesn't make sense. The reason for a wheel-like structure to a space station is to allow the station to be spun on an axis. This is done to simulate the effect of gravity, with a centrifugal force generated pushing the contents of the station onto the interior side of the exterior wall of the station. These walkways would not function as walkways if the station operated as such. There's an alternative possibility that I'll mention in the next note, but I've got 2 more things to say about the station. Fourth, there's a staircase down from the main body of the crater core into a dugout basement. The interior diameter of the stairwell is larger than the exterior diameter of the stairwell. Also, the stairs don't make sense for the same reason the walkways don't make sense. Lastly, on this point, I've considered the possibility that the reason so much of this doesn't make sense is if the crashed space station is actually a crashed spaceship. What if the reason it's so intact is that it's misnamed by the survivors of the war as a space station? I have to imagine the public would be aware of the nature of this vessel, but if it was a secret project, it could well be that they just assumed it was a space station. 10th, there are 3 reasons that I considered for why the space station would be constructed as it is, with the walkways on the wrong surfaces, etc. The first option was that I was visualizing it wrong, and for some reason the wheels spun around like this, with wheel B orbiting around axis A and wheel A orbiting around axis B. This seems like a nightmare to dock with, and I would have to wonder why they would construct it like this, but it would help to explain things. The second option was that the developers didn't consider the operations of the station when they were putting it on the ground, and because of this, they made some mistakes. The third option was that there's something we don't know about the technology behind the station. While anti-gravity generally doesn't seem to have been a tech known to humanity at the time, there is a possibility that this tech was existent and was in use here. There are 2 other places we see tech that resembles anti-gravity: the Mr. Handy, Miss Nanny, Mr. Gutsy line of robots, and iBots. While the former have jets of flame shooting out beneath them, that really seems like an implausible explanation for their flight capabilities. The amount of force coming out of that nozzle would have to be enough to counteract the force of gravity on the robot and then some. It's hard to see that lasting an hour, much less the years these robots have been able to roam the wastes. We don't really even have a way to explain why iBots float. It seems possible that in the closing years before the war, Robco and General Atomics may have been in the process of developing anti-gravity tech, and perhaps this explains the abilities of the robots and the locations of the walkways in the space station. One last point on the space station. 11th, Munch, the resident manufacturer of misinformation, makes the suggestion that aliens brought down the space station. As outlandish as that might sound, it might make some sense. First of all, we know there are aliens in the Fallout universe. Secondly, the space station is way more intact than it should be considering what it is and what happened to it. What if, in the aftermath of watching humanity destroy itself with nukes, some alien force did drop the space station through the atmosphere, stopping it from burning up on the way in? Maybe they saw humans as dangerous and they wanted to remove as many of them as they could detect from orbit. I'm not saying it was aliens, but it might have been aliens. 12th, as mentioned in the narrative, Weasel's power of speech was restored through the work of Caleb Fisher on tech designed by Dr. Eddie Harrison. Dr. Harrison was attempting to talk to animals, and this tech would allow them to converse with him. This is reminiscent of Dr. Dolittle, and as it just so happens, Dr. Dolittle was played by Rex Harrison in 1967 and Eddie Murphy in 1998. Combined, we have Eddie Harrison. 13th, I think it's quite possible that Gale is from Huntersville, West Virginia. Huntersville was the site of a clandestine FEV test run by Westech in conjunction with the US government. The water supply of the town was laced with FEV, and the people turned into super mutants over the course of weeks. In the town, there's a woman named Gail Myers who kept a record of what was happening during the testing, including her own transformation. She was also a sleeper agent for an unknown government agency working out of the Sugar Grove Black Site. It could easily not be her. There are a few spots that we know of on the East Coast where testing took place. It seems a crazy coincidence, though, that there would be a woman named Gail in the area that was turned into a super mutant, and another completely different super mutant in the same area, also named Gale. 14th, before the Wastelanders patch, there wasn't anything to be found at the site of the Crater Watch Station. I managed to capture this footage at the site in vanilla Fallout 76 after visiting the location in the test server. 15th, there's a terminal that lists scouting reports for the Crater Raiders, both in terms of scavenging sites and sites of potential trouble. I've spoken of a couple of these sites already, but let me list them now. In terms of scavenging sites, we can see that they were considering the Sons of Dane compound, the Kanawha Nuka-Cola plant, Camp Venture, and Westech. In terms of threats, they were most concerned about the mire, the entire mire, Grafton Steel, Knife's Edge, and the toxic waste disposal site. 16th, while I've spoken about Meg Groberg here in terms of her involvement with the narrative, I feel that I need to speak about her more specifically. Meg is a very interesting character that feels very real to me. I've constructed something of a biography for her that's based on explicit lore and some supposition, and I'll share that now. When the bombs came down, Meg Groberg was the teenage daughter of a single mother living near the poverty line. Her mother couldn't take the prospect of living in the new world, and thus she committed suicide, leaving her daughter to fend for herself. Meg wandered until she came to the Savage Divide, where she was recruited by the diehards. Having lived a rough life even before the bombs, and having lost her mother as she did, Meg developed serious trust issues that have led her to believe that everyone is out for themselves. She turned her attitude into sayings like, "Honor means nothing, survival means everything, and only one thing keeps you alive out here, 7-6, take or get taken." While this attitude serves as a defense against being taken advantage of, it has also tinted her view of reality to the point where she can't recognize when people are legitimately doing what they do for the greater good. Case in point, she thought the responders were just out for themselves, when they truly were trying to produce a scorched plague inoculation. Dr. Claire Hudson was so close to completing her work. I have no doubt that if Meg and her supporters within the diehards had assisted her, she would have completed her work back in 2096. While that was probably too late to save the post-war society, it would have saved a lot of lives. That said, she's not wholly shut off from the needs of others. She's invited people into her organization that would normally live on the fringes of society, like Gail and Lou. I think that having lived as something of an outsider herself, she sees something of herself in them. She's not blind to their faults, but she sees them as human and treats them accordingly. She also protects others from being taken advantage of as well. When Lev was making repeated unwanted passes at Barb, Meg threatened to emasculate him with her shotgun if he didn't stop. I think that the most interesting relationship she has is the one that she shares with Johnny Weston. Of all the people she might have considered having a serious relationship with, she's ended up with a con man. A highly competent and charismatic con man, but a con man nonetheless. I see two things in this relationship. First, she's gone into this relationship knowing she can't really trust Johnny, and in a way, this knowledge foresees betrayal and thereby blunts the pain that would come with said betrayal. And secondly, if you go with the concept that a girl's father serves as a model for the man she will someday choose to be with, then we have in Johnny something of a model for Meg's father. This, along with her never mentioning her father, is what leads me to believe that she was the child of a single mother when the bombs came down. Biography covered, I've got one more point, and it also covers Meg. Lastly, there have been two voice actors that have been the voice of Meg Groberg, Don Lewis and Mara Janot. Don Lewis can be heard on the old holotape Concerns with Margie from the Die Hard days, while Mara Janot is the voice actress of the character that we can meet in person. I don't know if there's a canonical reason for this change, or if we can simply assume that there was a scheduling issue or something like that, but I just thought this was interesting as the voices are quite different. One of my patrons, Malcontent, has suggested that the Meg we meet at Crater is not the original Meg, that the Crater Raiders have been taken over by an imposter who has infiltrated their organization, potentially explaining why she admires Johnny's infiltration. I don't know if there's any validity to this theory, but it's an interesting thought nonetheless. Alright, I think that'll do it for the story of the Raiders of the Crater. If you want to receive notifications when I launch lore videos, you can follow me on Twitter at GamingWithMaps. I'm streaming on YouTube once a week. Usually. I didn't this last week because I was ridiculously busy. I don't have a specific time nailed down, but I announce when I'm going to stream a day ahead on Twitter. Or earlier that day. If you're interested, come by and check it out. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 of Texas, Jill AWS, Dark Malcontent, Brian, Real76, Dr. Orion, Samsung Smart Fridge, Night Spearhead, and Ahotep for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.